Good evening, and thank you for coming tonight. While Mr. Nader is speaking, we're going to circulate a volunteer petition form that we hope that you sign on to. Any email or personal information that you give, it's not just for volunteers, it's for contact to let the campaign keep you informed. It will be kept in the strictest confidence. It won't be shared with others. It will only be used for the internal campaign purposes of providing you with updates on the campaign. If you want more than updates, we certainly hope that you'll volunteer to help Mr. Nader in his efforts this campaign season. Before Ralph Nader speaks, we're going to have a couple of local heroes speak. They won't be long, but I want to start with Dan Meek. Many of you might have heard of him. If you haven't, he's been doing the Oregon Attorney General's job for a long time with regard to protecting citizens against utilities. And he's been doing the work of hundreds of individuals with regard to trying to get campaign finance reform in Oregon so that we're not controlled by corporate money, we're controlled by our own will. With that, I give you Dan Meek.
Well, I've been discouraged from making any divisive remarks this evening. So I'll start out just by introducing the two speakers. Of course, the main speaker is Ralph Nader. Atlantic Magazine did a survey of historians a few years ago, and they compiled a list of the 100 most influential Americans of all time. 3 of those Americans still walk the face of the earth, and one of them is Ralph Nader. I need not introduce Ralph further. Lloyd Marbett has been a real full-time reformer in Oregon for 35 years by my count. He has reformed nuclear power in Oregon. He's reformed the power plant siting process in Oregon. He even tried to reform a credit union. He has protested many days and spent many nights in jail, and many days in jail as well. In fact, I've gone to court on more than one occasion to get him out of jail. And all the while, this last 35 years, he's done so while living in a van down by the river. Lloyd Marbett.
Thank you. Unfortunately, along with my fiancée, Catherine Chuddy, were, along with some of the other people in this credit union, evicted, and our membership was taken away for attempting to promote democratic values. It's really sad that that's the state of affairs that we find even in institutions like a cooperative, which is what credit unions are all about. Before I get to my prepared comments, I want to point out to you, on the back table as you've been coming in, you probably have heard me, there's an article that appeared in the Los Angeles Times 2 days ago called "Civilization's Last Chance. The planet is nearing a tipping point on climate change, and it gets much worse fast." I invite you to pick up copies of this article and read it. We are at the tipping point, and along with many issues, I think it's something that needs our attention. Obviously, it's long overdue, and I'm hoping that as we move forward into the future, we truly are going to change the equation, the political equation that we are currently suffering under. For as long as I can remember, I have wanted my country to become the things I was taught it aspired to be. for justice, for truth, for compassion, for freedom, for the generosity of the heart and the equality of man, for the true meaning behind its symbols and creed. Yet my country has fallen short of that dream, and the depth of the darkness around us is deep. I don't need to recount for you the long list of transgressions. We are immersed in them every day. We suffer the results and vie over which abuse should rise to the level of greatest attention. But you and I have come to hear someone who will address these transgressions far more eloquently than I. Like many of you, I have my heroes. They are the ones who guide us through our depression, the great depth of mourning we feel over the rape of the earth and the failing of its life support systems. These heroes are men and women who have the courage to stand up for what they believe, who do not waver in the face of abuse, who are like, in the words of E. E. Cummings, that great poet, someone that can love and who shall be continually reborn, a human being, somebody who said to those near him, when his or her fingers would not hold a brush, tie it into my hand. I am sure there are many reasons why each of you have come here this evening. I am sure that one of the things that we hold in common is that we care about life and the course of its future. How we get to that future is best described in the words of Homer Lee. To free a nation from error is to enlighten the individual, and it is only to the degree that an individual is receptive of the truth that a nation can be free from that vanity which ends in national ruin. The crimes against nature, against humanity, against the very foundations of democracy are mounting. The only way to stop these crimes is to unfetter democracy and free the soul of accountability. We can no longer drink the poisons presented to us in every election. The sideline issues of sensationalism, manipulating outcomes decided by rigged election procedures, electronically hacked voting machines, unlimited campaign contributions, or a conservatively stacked Supreme Court. Enough is enough. We can no longer tolerate a corporate media concentrated in the hands of the few, telling a nation of sheep how to think. I'm glad that Ralph Nader is running for president. It is his right to do so, and it is an honor to support him. Regardless of whether you are a Democrat or a Republican, a Pacific Green, a Libertarian, or an Independent, the real issues are the right of all political candidates to be heard, the decorporatization of democracy, public ownership of the airwaves, and the integrity of our election process, which should be publicly owned as well. If we don't have these rights, we have nothing, and everything else is just a mirage of choice. I submit to you that not only must we stop the war, but we must stop the war on ourselves. We must stop the preying on the economically disadvantaged in order to turn them into soldiers of empire. Instead of peacemakers, exploiters of resources. Instead of emissaries of sustainability, consumers of death, rather than the stewards of life. It's going to take more than a presidential election to change this world. But it begins here, right now, with you and me no longer willing to play these deadly games of manipulation. We must elevate the issues above political personalities and support the courage of those willing to act on the issues rather than speak to us in sound bites and betray us in office. We must raise the bar of what it takes to earn our support and stop the stampeding fear of lemmings who are no longer willing to critically think. For I believe those words in the song Chicago by Crosby, Stills, and Nash continue to hold true. We can change the world, rearrange the world. It's dying to get better. I thank each of you for working to change the world, and I wish all of you well in the journey. Thank you. I now have the honor of introducing the next speaker. In order to do so, I'd like to read a short passage from a book he has written called The 17 Traditions. This particular passage is found towards the end of the book, and I think the best personifies the honor of what you and I are about to experience. And I quote, "There's a great joy in pursuing justice, and that joy should be available to everyone. Children develop their notions of fairness at a very early age. In their innocence, they are often able to imagine a world without poverty, war, or pollution far more easily than their elders. They have no axe to grind, which gives them a wonderful clarity and optimism. Through their words, deeds, and traditions, my family gave me the gift of believing in such ideas. Their strengths were my metabolism. They propelled me to try to reach as many people as I could and to try to show them that the most of our problems had solutions if only people would give themselves enough time to stand up and be counted. And if only some of us would stand tall and lead. For the people do have that power, but only if they recognize it and then take the time to apply it. That is the biggest if in politics, isn't it? But that is the best reason for trying to make the flowers of democracy bloom. There's an ancient Chinese proverb whose words I carry with me everywhere I go. One that captures the spirit of my parents' legacy. To know and not to do is not to know. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you Ralph Nader, candidate for President of the United States.
Half of democracy is showing up. Showing up at rallies, meetings, gatherings like this, courtrooms, showing up at city council gatherings, showing up at neighborhood council gatherings. Back in 1775, in my home state of Connecticut, according to the primary materials in a book I read through once in a while about the American Revolution, several thousand people showed up in a field at Farmington, Connecticut, to protest the policies of King George III. At that time, I don't think Connecticut had more than 80,000 people. They came by foot, by horse, by wagon, several thousand. What do you think it would take today to get several thousand people at Farmington, Connecticut? The great labor leader, Eugene Debs, in the early part of the 20th century, took a train to Chicago to speak to people in Chicago. 200,000 people showed up in a field. There was no email, no internet. A lot of people didn't have electricity. How come they showed up years ago? Huge labor rallies. When's the last time you saw a huge labor rally addressed by the head of the union? When is the last time you saw large rallies of farmers, even those that are left? It's very difficult. We watch screens, television, computer, video, hour after hour, day after day, week after week. We're in virtual reality, not reality. How many of you here tonight, on reflection, could have easily brought 2 more people who you count as your relatives, friends, neighbors, or co-workers? How many? Why not? You think you're here for me? You think you're here for Nader Gonzalez? You're here for you. You can tell these people, you come to the Benson High School auditorium to defend yourself, defend your future, defend your children's life possibilities, defend the preservation of the earth. But we look at screens, we isolate ourselves, or we use email, or we just don't like to try to persuade people to break their Tuesday evening routine. I remember when I started to take on the auto companies, I would hitchhike to Washington from Connecticut, partly to save money, and partly I like the adventure. Always learned from people who picked me up. One guy laid bricks, another guy was a tree surgeon, had a monopoly audience. And I went to Washington, and one day a truck driver picked me up in Delaware, and he said to me, "Where are you going?" I said, "To Washington, D.C. "Why?" I said, "Because I'm going to federally regulate the automobile industry." He gave me a funny look. I thought he was going to drop me off on the road. Was that a display of excessive pride? No. It was a reflection that I lost a lot of friends in high school and college. In cars that couldn't protect them from crashes, even 20 miles an hour, because there was no airbag, no seat belt, no padded dash panel, no steering column, collapsibility, no side impact, no stronger door latches, no head restraints, all the things we take for granted, which the engineers in Detroit know how to do decades and decades and decades ago. In fact, the padded dash panel was prevalent on the ancient Roman chariots. How's that? They gave GM 2,000 years lead time. At that time, death on the highway was the first leading cause of death for people age 4 to 24. And I got to Washington, and people thought I was a CIA agent when they said, "What are you doing?" I said, "I'm pushing to regulate the auto companies." They thought that was the cover. Why am I telling you this story? Well, it ended up very nicely. The highway and auto safety laws were passed by Congress in 1966, signed by Lyndon Johnson, a nice White House ceremony he invited me to, and irregularly enforced to save over 1 million lives, and a lot of lives overseas because the other foreign auto companies had to meet our standards, and millions of injuries prevented or reduced in severity. Now, did that take 1 million people dropping everything they're doing? No. It took about 10 people, some engineers, I organized, a few key people in Congress, one of them being Senator McCain from Washington State, who's chairman of the Senate Commerce Committee. What it took was the media performing its responsibility to cover this. General Motors hiring detectives to follow me and lure me into compromising positions with young women, and being caught in the Senate office building trailing me when I was slated to be a Senate witness. That happens to be a federal crime to intimidate a witness slated for testimony for a Senate hearing. The press covered it, and when people found out that these cars could have saved their lives, that the engineers were prohibited from doing this, that these cars were built as psychosexual dreamboats that collapsed on the occupants, killed them even in a 15-mile collision if their head hit some cookie cutters on the dash panel, they really got upset. And there was a swell, there was a rumble up there. And the result was the fastest federal regulation of a major industry in American history. 6 months it took. Now, we went on to do this with the coal industry that was exposing coal miners to black lung disease and mine shaft accidents due to negligence. In 1900 to year 2000, over 450,000 coal miners gave their lives for their companies. That's more than all the Americans killed in World War II. That's just one industry. Then we went on to establish the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, opposed by all the corporate lobbies. We overcame them. And then the Product Safety Commission, air and water, pollution control laws, the establishment of the Environmental Protection Agency. Why did Nixon sign these bills? And more. He disagreed with these bills. He was a right-wing Republican. He would sign one after the other with a flourishing language, declaring how important this legislation was. He signed it because he was afraid of the rumble of the people coming out of the 60s, when enough of them showed up to be counted. Passive civil disobedience, nonviolent, marching, picketing, sitting in, teaching. Shame on us. Shame on us today. And shame is a great motivator if you allow it to infiltrate your mind and your conscience. Shame on us for not showing up. Not showing up to defend our country from the most criminal regime in American history residing in the White House. From the most impeachable presidency in American history. A presidency that is impeachable for a criminal war of aggression against Iraq that was unconstitutional, violated federal law and international treaties. Impeachable because of systemic torture, violating the U.S. Army Field Manual, the Constitution, Geneva Convention, to which we belong. Impeachable because he arrested thousands of Americans, put them in jail without even charges. No habeas corpus. Some of them had funny sounding names. Those are the ones that usually get the brunt, don't they? But when they do get the brunt, don't think that people with non-funny sounding names are not going to lose their freedom and their liberty. spying on thousands of Americans in violation of the FISA Act without a judicial warrant. That's a 5-year jail term. That's a felony. Bush and Cheney did it. Again and again. This is not a Watergate single episode. This is not lying about sex under oath, the way Clinton did. These impeachable offenses are continuing day in and day out. This violence in our name, abroad, backing regimes like the Israeli military to oppress and destroy the Palestinian people with your tax dollars, against the opinion of the Israeli people. This is not the first time countries are run by minority hardliners. We're run by minority hardliners. In Washington today, 70% of the American people want out of Iraq. A majority of Jewish Americans and Arab Americans, again and again, want a two-state solution over there. 64% of the Israelis polled want negotiations with Hamas, according to the great Israeli newspaper that does these polls, Haaretz. 64%. Do you hear about it here? 64%. 28% opposed. And a lot of ex-generals spoke out in favor of that 64%. Hamas, which was started years ago with the substantial help of the Israeli and U.S. government to counteract the PLO. How many times has that happened? Showing up. We've got to talk to our neighbors and friends and multiply ourselves to show up. Because the politicians look at the number of people who show up, and Nixon was so concerned with people showing up on the campuses, in the streets, in Washington. The last Republican president who feared liberals, the kind of liberals who settle for the least worst of the two parties, even though every 4 years both parties get worse, because the liberals never put any demands on the least worst, like the anti-war movement in Ontario. Showing up. The second attitude we've got to have. I mean, Lloyd pointed out some of the problems. We don't have to go through all the problems. You wouldn't be here if you weren't knowledgeable about them and sensitive to them. Is how do we motivate ourselves? How do we motivate ourselves to have a higher estimate of our own significance as citizens? To break our routines? To carve out some civic time from our personal time? To realize that personal freedom doesn't mean we live in a democracy. Dictators allow people to have personal freedom. Marry who they want, go down the road when they want, buy what they want, play bowling when they want, play cards when they want. That's not real freedom. That's important freedom for daily living. But the real freedom to shape the future of the country and the world is civic freedom. It's what Marcus Cicero said over 2,000 years ago when he defined freedom for all time, in my judgment. He said freedom is participation in power. So when politicians use that word freedom, as Reagan did, and as Bush 1 did, and as Clinton did, were they really meaning that they wanted to give you, the people, participation in power? Of course not. They were using it as a slogan, as a verbal massage to make us feel good. Because they didn't want to use the word tyranny. They used the word freedom. Freedom is participation in power. Local government, state government, national government. The decision to go to war, not to go to war. The decision to clamp down on the silent violence we too charitably call pollution that produces cancer, respiratory ailments. The decision as to whether whole counties in California are going to be sprayed in the coming weeks because of the moth problem, without having a referendum, without having public hearings about the exposure of people and infants to the spraying. Motivation. Look at our forebears. How would you like to have been an abolitionist against slavery in 1830 in Mississippi or Virginia? How would you like to have been leading the sit-down strikes against Ford and GM in the 1930s. You put your whole job on the line. There was no unemployment compensation. There weren't many jobs then. They had to feed their family. They put their lives on the line. How would you like to fit then like that? Pretty tough. How about leading the drive for women's right to vote? They'd go door to door, and they'd have dirty water poured on their heads by people on the second floor. They'd laugh, scoot them away, or they'd be arrested and dragged to prison in Washington, D.C. when they were picketing in front of the White House. What was their crime? That women wanted the right to vote. Who opposed them? Well, some men did it, but it was the industrialists, because the women were leading the movement against child labor. They were leading the movement against a lot of the hard edges of the Industrial Revolution. They were the leaders of the consumer movement when it was launched in its modern form in 1900 because of food inflation. These companies didn't like women. Getting the vote was bad enough. They were being challenged without their having the vote. But they went through it. They didn't quit. They didn't make excuses for themselves. Those workers who formed the trade unions in the late 19th century, the farmer, populist, progressive movement against the big railroads and the banks that were stifling their right to live a decent life with high railroad freight rates and high interest rates. Imagine, put yourself in the shoes of those dirt poor farmers in East Texas, 1887, when it started. They signed up 200,000 of their fellow farmers in 6 months. $1 dues a year. That's $50 now, equivalent. And they were dirt poor. And they had no electricity, no motor vehicles. They had no telephones. They had no internet. They just had their head, their heart, and their feet. And they had a cause to take on the most powerful corporations in America. And it spread all over the country in the most fundamental reform movement. They didn't make excuses for themselves. They didn't say they were predisposed and preoccupied, the way the lawyers of America are doing now in letting this criminal regime escape on January 21, 2009, as fugitives from justice, without any sheriffs pursuing them, thanks to the Democratic Party. Second motivation, your children and grandchildren. What are you going to tell them? The country's crumbling. 80% of the people are falling behind economically. Single moms trying to raise their kids, jobbing in half, with no daycare, unless they pay $500 or more a month. And they got to commute with $4 gasoline. And if they get sick, the price of medicine is out of sight, thanks to the drug companies who are making huge profits and are subsidized by you, the taxpayer. They're called tax credits. And the U.S. government gives them the result of discovered and tested drugs free to market without any price restraints, drugs that you paid for, like Taxol, the anti-cancer drug, $31 million of your money through the National Cancer Institute, and they gave the drug to Bristol Myers Squibb, who then was charging women with ovarian cancer $14,000 for 6 treatments. That's life for most people in this country. Difficult. Congested traffic. Running around. No time to think. No time to breathe. No time for their children. This is the richest country in the world, where the head of Walmart makes $12,000 an hour, 8 hours a day, and his workers are making $7, $8, $9, $10. In medieval Europe, there wasn't that kind of wealth yet. And it's worse. There's some CEOs making $100,000 an hour. Just imagine. It's hard to sink in. There are some CEOs in this country who go to work on January 2, 9 a.m. By 9:10, they heed the call of nature. And they go to the men's room, and they finish their job. They come back by 9:15. They've made more than their executive secretary will make in the entire year. This is the land of the free, the home of the brave. What gets people upset these days? Gender slurs, ethnic slurs, racial slurs. Not the conditions that those slurs reflect, like asbestos in the lungs of our inner city kids, high levels of asthma, high levels of lead from lead-based paint crumbling off crumbling tenement walls. Who marches for that? Who loses their job? But don't ever have a racial slur. Don't ever have an ethnic slur. You can lose your job. You want us to have Bush impeached? Here's how you get Bush impeached. Not for killing 1 million Iraqis. Not for blowing apart a country that didn't threaten us. Not for endangering our national security by becoming a recruiting ground over there for more and more fighters coming to challenge us. And that's what General Casey and other Bush generals have said. Our military presence is a recruiting ground. More and more. Young men will learn the art of sabotage and violence. Pursuing terrorists by creating more terrorists. Even a dog wouldn't be that dumb. Here he is. 4,300 U.S. soldiers lost their lives, mostly low-income whites, Latinos, and African Americans. Jenna and Barbara listen to their father every week say, the war in Iraq is worth the sacrifice. What have they sacrificed? Have they joined the armed services? Have Cheney's children joined the armed services? Have members of Congress' children joined the armed services, except for the children of Senator Webb and Senator McCain? And we don't even make a demand that they do so. You want to get this country out of war? Just pass a simple law. Before Congress and the White House, plunge us into war, legal or illegal. All able-bodied, military-aged children and grandchildren of all members of Congress, the President and the Vice President will be drafted into the armed services. So what are we going to tell our grandchildren and children when they look us in the eye at age 9, sitting on our knee? Huh? Where were you, Grandpa, Grandma, when this country was crumbling? Yeah, we got a lot of excuses. Well, we were watching television, updating our profile on Facebook. What's our excuse? There's no excuse here. Don't think that personal freedom is any more than a fraction of the definition of what a democracy can produce. Do you think we have any influence on foreign policy, the way we're operating, the level of passivity and withdrawal? Any influence on half of the federal government's operating expenditure going to the military budget? There's no more Soviet Union. The military budget is really Lockheed Martin's budget, Grumman's budget, General Dynamics' budget. More and more gigantic weapon systems. We got enough weapons now to blow the earth up 300 times and make the rubble bombs. It's still growing. It's still expanding. And then we say, why isn't there enough money to repair our bridges, our streets, create modern public transit systems, make our schools and clinics and libraries whole again? Why isn't there enough money to upgrade our sewage treatment systems ecologically, or to clean our drinking water systems? So many of these drinking water systems are violating the 1974 drinking law, safety law that we got through. Lead, arsenic, residues of heavy metals. Now we hear there are medicines, residue of medicines in the drinking water. But we're building another submarine that can blow up 200 cities. This is Sparta. This isn't democratic Athens. And we let it happen. We, the people, let the corporations, run our country to the ground. Look what these corporations do. They have no sense of patriotism. They have no allegiance to our country. These are the big corporations we hear and read about, buy products from. General Motors and Exxon and Pfizer and Citibank and so on. And they rose to profit on the backs of American workers And when they got in trouble, they went to Washington to get bailed out by American taxpayers. And when they get in trouble overseas, they get rescued by American Marines. And what's their debt of gratitude to America? They basically say to America, we're out of here with your jobs and your industry to communist and fascist dictators who can put their workers in their place at 50 cents an hour in dangerous working conditions. And then ship the products back here, contaminated farm-bred fish from China, defective tires from China. We're re-importing all the pollution that these dictatorships allow to occur because they don't really have pollution control laws. Is that the way they're treating our workers and our taxpayers? There is no allegiance to any country or community by these corporations, and we let them get away with it. And we let them use our tax dollars to build these football stadiums and these sports arenas, while the schools, clinics, and libraries in the same city are crumbling for lack of money for repairs. And we let them get away with it. It comes down to our own self-respect as citizens. Are we ever good at making excuses for avoiding our civic duties? We let politicians flatter us, flummox us, and fool us. They flatter us into inactivity and supine admiration for their empty rhetoric. When back in Washington, their record is opposite to their rhetoric. Look at Clinton, Obama, McCain. McCain doesn't really like the idea that wrongfully injured Americans should have their full day in court under the tort law system. He wants tort reform. Imagine using the word reform to indicate taking people's rights away at their massively most intense moment of weakness, when they've been rendered paraplegic, quadriplegic by defective products, automobiles, and other defective products. Clinton, she's never seen a weapon system she doesn't like. After all, she's a woman. She's got to be tough. She's got to appear macho. She's got to say, if Iran attacks Israel, she'll obliterate Iran. That's what she said. And there are 75 million people in Iran. They're civilians. And Iran has never attacked anyone in 250 years. Iran is a country that's been attacked by the U.S. through Saddam Hussein, has had its prime minister overthrown by the U.S. in 1953, and is targeted for invasion by the criminal regime in the White House. No wonder they're getting scared, and they're making it like they're doing nuclear weapon research, and they're years away from that. And what if they did have a nuclear weapon? What would they do with it? Israel has 250 of them. We have thousands of them. Are they going to commit suicide? They want to defend themselves, and we've targeted them as the axis of evil, along with Iraq and North Korea, and we've blown Iraq apart. I wonder why the Iranians are scared. This is insane. What's going on? There's no other word for it. People act this way individually, they'd be committed. But politicians and corporations get away with collective insanity. And Obama, here he is, back in Illinois, 40 he's a U.S. Senator, openly supporting Palestinian rights. Friend with Professor Khalidi, who's now at Columbia University. Everybody who knew him those days knew he was quite outspoken before he became a politician. Now he doesn't dare say anything about the suffering Palestinians after he made a statement like that over a year ago. Oh boy, he was taken to the woodshed by the AIPAC people, the Israeli military government lobby support in the U.S. And they don't even represent a majority of Jewish opinion. The American Jewish Committee, which really likes it, had a poll the other day, and more Jewish Americans said they wanted a two-state solution than said no. And there are other polls that had them up close to 68%. They don't even represent Jewish American opinion, but they have huge influence in Washington and in Congress. And Barack Obama, he tells us he's from the third world. He's lived in Indonesia. His father comes from Kenya. He's not going to be parochial, and he can't stand up for the people who are in the largest prison in the world, Gaza, 147 square miles with 1.5 million people being blockaded, embargoed, medicine, fuel, electricity, food. For what? For resisting a little bit? Far more missiles have been fired more accurately into Gaza by the Israeli military. Objected to by some ex-military people in Israel, very, very courageously. Then these crude garage-built rockets, half of whom fall in Gaza, and the other half fall with a thud. Casualties have been committed on both sides. You know what the ratio is? Civilian casualties, 400 to 1 in the last year. 400 civilian casualties, deaths and injuries on the Palestinian side, to 1 on the Israeli. So who is the occupier? Who is the occupier? Who's doing the embargo? Who's keeping people in Gaza from even being able to do kidney dialysis? They can't even get medical equipment. The UN is objecting to this. They can't get their aid in. And Obama won't stand up for these people? You think he will if he becomes president? Don't bet on him. Cowardliness in a politician is like a contagious virus. Doesn't go away. It stays. So what are we left with here? Well, back to Eugene Debs. At the end of his career, a reporter asked him, Mr. Debs, what is your greatest regret? And Mr. Debs said, my greatest regret is that the American people, under the Constitution, can have almost anything they want, but they don't seem to want anything at all. Fast forward, 1945. The United States, the #1 military and economic power in the world after World War II. Western Europe, rubble, destroyed cities, disconsolate people. Millions have died. Starvation is looming. And here's what they did. They demanded and got full health insurance for everyone. They demanded and got laws that facilitated forming trade unions to collectively bargain against large corporations. They demanded and got 4 to 6 weeks paid vacation, paid maternity leave, paid family sick leave, sometimes up to a year in the countries like the Netherlands. They demanded and got decent public transit and the rebuilding of parks and government support for the arts. They demanded and got daycare. By law, 62 years later, in the United States of America, land of the free, home of the brave, we have none of these by law. That's what Eugene Debs meant when he said the American people can have almost anything they want, but they don't seem to want much of anything at all. So don't let politicians inflate your head with the phrase that the United States is the greatest country in the world, because the corporations have made sure that it is not the greatest country in the world in infant mortality, in reduction of hunger, in a reduction of poverty, in paying a living wage, which the Europeans have. It is not the greatest country in the world, and allowing a one bread earner per family to have a middle-class standard of living. 2 now can't have a middle-class standard of living for the majority of the people in that 2-income family category. They're in debt, they're in debt, they're in debt. What's the difference between us and the Europeans? They were coming out of the rubble, and they desperately wanted a decent life, and they defined it in the way I've just given you. you. The examples, including the living wage. 1 out of every 3 full-time workers in this country doesn't have a living wage. What's a living wage? Well, it's not $6.50 an hour. It's not $7 an hour. It's not $9 an hour without health insurance. It's Walmart wages. We have great entertainment. We're #1 in the world in entertainment. #1 in the world in sports. Number 1 in the world in arms exports, often to dictators that use them on their own people, if not against our soldiers. We're #1 in the world in piling up incredible riches for the top 1/10 of 1% of the people. We're #1 in the world in deferring the necessities of the people. We're #1 in the world in deferred maintenance for our public works. Let's get rid of this false pride. That's how they manipulate us. They talk about the flag. There's the flag. When you look at that flag, what do you think? What do you think? You think of military victories. You think of soldiers carrying it. You think maybe the Pledge of Allegiance. But what are the last words of the Pledge of Allegiance that these politicians ignore? It's with liberty and justice for all. Not liberty and justice for some. Not liberty and justice for most. Liberty and justice for all. But we don't grow up looking at that flag representing with liberty and justice for all. Heaven forbid that would be a discussion in what's left of our civics classes, in our schools. The Nader Gonzalez campaign is one that is authentic, it reflects accomplishments on behalf of the people. For 40 years, Matt Gonzalez is a 42-year-old civil rights lawyer in San Francisco. He was president of the San Francisco City Council after being elected to the City Council as an underdog. And he almost was elected mayor as an underdog. He's now a civil rights lawyer. You're going to hear a lot more from him in the coming years, which is one of the purposes of these presidential campaigns, to bring younger people into political activity who stand for the people, not rubber for the corporation. Now look what happens when enough people show up. 30, 40 years ago, who would have dreamed that Russians would be here and we'd be over in Russia supervising the dismantling of nuclear warheads? It's happened. Who would have dreamed some 40 years ago when I started going after the tobacco companies because they smoked, because people smoked on airlines and buses and trains. I didn't particularly enjoy that. And I didn't like children and little infants having to breathe that stuff in. And so we, against the opposition to the tobacco industry, we got separation. Some of you may remember separation of planes, smoking, non-smoking. Then we got no smoking on all planes later. We would have dreamed the trial lawyers after losing one case after another. One case after another against the tobacco industry would finally, the state attorney generals, get them, thank you, get them to pay $250 billion in compensation for the state's health care costs due to the devastation of tobacco. Our country has a lot of examples like that. We don't see them on TV enough. We don't hear them on radio. We have been lobotomized from history. We have been made to forget the highest moments of our history. The moments of citizen valor, the moments of a few citizens being told it will never happen, it's impossible, forget it, you can't fight City Hall, you can't take on these corporations, and these citizens say, watch us. Well, one reason, of course, we don't hear that, and a lot of people in the younger age group don't even know about it, is that we don't control what we own in this country. One of the systemic ways corporations control us is they make sure that they control the greatest wealth in in our country that we own together as a Commonwealth. We own 1/3 of America, the public lands, the timber, oil, gas companies control. We own the public airways over which radio and TV stations transmit their programs. The radio and TV stations control our public areas. We don't have our own radio and TV stations or networks because we don't grow up understanding what we own. And so we don't even know that they're controlling what we own. We're the landlords, the radio and TV stations are the tenants. They pay us no rent via the Federal Communications Commission. They've had it free since the 1927 Radio Act, our property. And they decide who says what, who doesn't on TV. And they give us 90% of the time entertainment and advertising. That's real exciting. If we controlled what we own, tonight's gathering would be televised live all over the greater Portland, Oregon. The same is true for all the research and development taxpayers pay. It ends up in the hands of the drug companies, the containerization companies, the semiconductor companies, the aerospace companies, the pharmaceutical companies, the biotech companies. You think they did that with their own money? They did that with the taxpayers' research and development. NASA, Department of Defense, National Institutes of Health, give it to them free. They don't even have a taxpayer appreciation day, these corporations, to say thank you to us. But they put full-page ads about their great innovations as if they funded and developed them. Nonsense. Propaganda. It's lies. There are a lot of ways they control us. They control every government agency and department in Washington. Department of Defense, Treasury, Agriculture, Interior, Food and Drug Administration, Auto Safety Agency, FAA. They've taken our government completely from us. That's why I'm standing here. For 20 years we've gotten things done in Washington on behalf of the people. Their health, safety, economic well-being, Freedom of Information Act. And now it's not possible. The doors are shut, except for corporate lobbyists. 35,000 of them, 10,000 political action committees pumping money into these politicians' coffers, and they get their executives in high government positions. Now you wonder why the government doesn't address the necessities of the American people. Now you wonder why they don't use your tax dollar, honestly. Now you wonder why they use your tax dollar to plunder overseas and defend these corporate criminals. Now you wonder why they don't put prosecutorial budgets to the level needed to go after the corporate crime wave, from Enron to Wall Street that has looted and drained trillions of dollars from your pensions, from your investments, from your savings, and all kinds of lost jobs. It's because we don't have a government. The corporations are now our government. And the corporations don't have a single vote, do they? They have power and they have money. But they don't have a vote. We're the only ones that have a vote. So why are they so powerful? Because the courts back in 1886 gave them all the constitutional rights we have. What an absurdity. An artificial entity called the corporation. We're not talking about the employees. The entity, Exxon, General Motors, again, has all the constitutional rights you and I have, except the Fifth Amendment. Therefore, given that they can concentrate power like no billionaire can over capital, labor, technology, pit governments against one another, pit states against one another to get more and more subsidies. Oh, where are you going to move your plant? Well, who's going to bid? Tennessee, Michigan, Oregon? We can't have any equal justice under the law between you and Exxon or you and General Motors. Look what these corporations are doing to us. It's called strategic planning. They're planning our political future, our labor future, our election future, our governmental future, our educational future, our communications future, our pharmaceutical future, our health future, our genetic future, and a good deal of our military and foreign policy future. And they're not human beings. They don't vote. They don't have children. They don't have grandparents. They don't have parents. They don't die in Iraq. And we don't learn about this in the schools. We don't learn about it in the colleges. We don't even learn about it in the law schools. the level of propaganda and the corporatist grip in our minds. And partly they succeed because we grow up corporate. I grew up corporate. You grew up corporate. You want me to test you? What do you think right now when I use the following words?
Crime, violence, regulation, and welfare. Crime, violence, regulation, and welfare. What are the images? Street crime, wars, rapes, poor waiting for their checks, welfare checks, government regulation. To some degree, that's obviously true. But to a far greater degree, there is corporate crime that steals far more than larcenies or burglaries. Corporate violence that destroys more lives than street crime, by far. Corporate regulation of your lives. They're closing the courtroom door when you have a